right, welcome back to the Content That Grows podcast. We're getting back at it this week. Wanted to talk about a topic that comes up for a lot of marketers for various reasons. We hear about it from a lot of clients who kind of want to better understand their investment in content. So I think most SaaS marketers, and even based on what we see in social, there's a lot of conversation around content and that return on investment, or content ROI.
Yep.
So this week we're going to dive into that and kind of have a discussion back and forth. And I'd like to start out with just like getting some ideas from you, Nate. I think from someone who's been kind of in this marketing space, long enough to call it a career. I think I'd like to start with talking about, how has the idea or what's important changed for you around content ROI as you've kind of progressed and moved up the ladder?
Yeah, I think it certainly has evolved, even just in kind of like the almost 9 years that I was at Sprout. Like, came in as sort of IC first marketer doing everything. So there was, and I was 25. Like, it was not, I was not super experienced. So I think initially there's a lot of focus, whether it's any marketing or content marketing specifically. It's like, what is the can I get traffic? Sort of like step one for a lot of people. But I think then there's like cost per lead, is where I think a lot of it ultimately boils down to, for a lot of people in terms of like how they think of ROI is, I'm getting, leads or free trials or demo requests at this price, and that's acceptable, and I'm going to keep doing that. And I would say, over time, and certainly evolving into like VP level and, having, I think, more ownership and more responsibility at the level, I think it's pretty natural to kind of move into like, okay, well, not just cost per lead, but like, what's the CAC? Like, what does it actually cost to acquire a customer? And that's where you get much more intelligent around, okay, well, this channel generates leads, but they don't turn into customers, and then that's just not as helpful. And then I think, ultimately kind of move into like CAC to LTV type of stuff where you're like, okay, well, we can get customers, but now we dig in and understand that, 50% of this channel customers churn after 3 months. And, some of these are actually better and they grow. And it's like, net negative churn on these channels, things like that. So I think it's just like really getting to the point where you understand what's truly impactful for the business long term. I think is sort of how that kind of ladders up over time. And so I think that, when you think about from a content perspective, like, no, you should not be measuring every podcast episode or every blog post by, the leads it generates, or especially not all the way into, CAC and LTV. But overall, kind of understanding how those fit into the bigger picture and what you're trying to accomplish. And then I think the other piece is that, trying to just like hit a number for a month or, for a quarter has a very short-term perspective, and you're going to really double down on the places where there's just like a lot more attributable ROI. And I think the other piece that I've kind of learned over time is like, there are certainly things that the ROI, over time, and I think we'll talk about this more today, is actually like progress towards a long-term goal. And so that, I think is a bit more of a nuance as well, and kind of understanding what things should be measured by, immediate ROI, and what things are more of a progress measurement.
For sure. I guess a curiosity question I have kind of around this is like, would you say that your sort of view of ROI as it changed was just a product of like the positions you held at those companies?
I think yes, to some extent, and I think also just maturing with the company. Like when I started, we literally had we had no data on like what actually brought paying customers. Like that, I think we finally got that stood up maybe 8 months in. So like, initially you could kind of like correlate a little bit, and Google Analytics tracking kind of worked for that, but not really. But it took a while to really even get to a point where we had it stood up and could actually understand that. And then that was awesome. It was like, cool, whole new world. I'm going to cut this, 20% of our spend here because it's actually generating no customers. And we really started to get smarter. So some of it was just also the natural evolution of the business. Because I think if I had come in at the level and the role that I was in into a more mature company, I think I already would have fallen in line with the maturity that they had there. So I would say it was probably both my role evolving, but also the company maturing. I think would be the two big things.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I can relate to that as we kind of figure out our own like steady thing. I mean, I thought you asked a really great question, and I think running into profound questions helps you sort of learn what the best ROI is, or like what potentially is going to generate that.
Yeah.
But even we were chatting yesterday about like finding like, okay, where are the evergreen channels versus the channels where we got to like really, really work to drag out every single lead, was just like another way to sort of figure out like, okay, where do these things exist that are, I don't want to call it like an easier lift or like easier to execute on, but in some ways it's like a different type of execution.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think you see that with some companies that, and like for some companies, events, like in-person events are just genuinely a very good channel for them, just the nature of their industry and the product and whatever. But like, I've certainly worked, especially on the consulting side, with companies that it almost feels like this trap where like, they're like, we have these 6 events over the course of the year and we have to get this from it because like we don't have much, like that's the majority of it. And we don't have like this recurring motion and like consistent opportunity generation month by month. It's very, very lumpy. And that, I think that just gets more stressful and also just harder from an ROI standpoint, planning standpoint, all of that to kind of know what to expect. So I think the totally fine if your business benefits from those things that are, one-off or quarterly or whatever, but making sure you have some of the like ways to balance it out with consistency, I think is really important.
For sure.
Yeah.
I feel like I have to ask this because we obviously are seeing a ton of layoffs happen, a lot of predictions about what type of recession we're in, bubbles, etc. And I'd be curious if you think, the desired ROI or outcome for content marketing, does it shift for companies or the way they talk about it during these types of economic downturns? I'd love to get your input on that.
Yeah. I think there's a couple layers to it. I would say, first of all, like, yes, I think it does shift to some extent because I think there's, just like in paid campaigns that there's, or like paid channels that there's certain campaigns that have maybe been allowed to run less efficiently than they should have been and now are getting more scrutiny and being shut down. I think there's also quite a few, different things, whether it's like the strategy and the topics being created for the blog or other types of content that are maybe nice to have and we've kind of been doing it, and now there's sort of this like, hey, we're not in a growth at all cost mindset, we're in an efficiency mindset, and so we're going to scrutinize the types of content and some of that stuff. So I think certainly that happens, but I also think that there are quite a few companies that fall into one of two buckets. One is there's sort of the conventional wisdom, which is like, you should not cut sales and marketing and like keep doing that in a downturn and like invest for long term. And so I think a lot of companies who are already investing in content understand the long term aspect of that, and they're continuing. And I think the other camp is the number of companies that like content and SEO is far and away their biggest channel and their number one revenue driver, and not something that's a nice to have. And so again, there's probably some level of scrutiny and efficiency happening there, but still having that long-term view and continue to invest in it. So like with a lot of things and just kind of in general, I think overall like the correction's not a bad thing. Like if you scaled up your program and you're just churning out tons of top of funnel content that has nothing to do with your audience or really in any way tying to the product ever, this could be a good way to kind of naturally, end some of that stuff that shouldn't have been happening anyway. So, yeah, so I think there's that. And then certainly there's like, from like purely an ROI standpoint, I think, the people that are looking at it long term aren't looking for that immediate ROI, and the people who are expecting immediate ROI and starting to kind of hunker down and have a very short term view on things are probably the ones that are cutting a bit deeper on the content programs.
For sure. I guess my follow up to that would be, if you're responsible for coming in and evaluating a content marketing program, like what are the first things you're coming in to look at?
Specifically in a downturn or just at any point?
Yeah, I would say specifically in a downturn, but I mean, at any point is
either
also very valuable.
I think, one, it kind of actually just kind of builds on what I just said, which is like, when you come into something existing, whether there's 20 blog posts or podcast episodes or whatever, 20 pieces of content or like 2,000, like one of the first things is like, does like the topics and the nature of what's happening, does it ladder up to the positioning and the direction that we want the company to go in? So again, if you're writing about like, Joey's favorite pizza toppings on Friends and, whatever, and like somehow expecting that to tie to your business, not great. But if your content is at least in some way, even if it's higher in the funnel, kind of laddering into that, then I think, that's a positive sign. And then we see with a lot of clients opportunities just to prune stuff that isn't a good fit, whether it's because they've evolved over time or just it shouldn't have been created in the first place. Similarly, like, is it aligned to ICP? So that, again, ICP can shift over time. But also like from the qualitative standpoint, like who's engaging with it, and so whether that's, content that's being clipped up and shared on social or your newsletter or whatever, like who's actually liking and commenting on social posts, who's actually subscribing to the newsletter. Again, some of those indicators of like, are we building in the right direction? Are we bringing in the right people? That kind of stuff. And then I think, from beyond that, it's sort of, as much as you can, if it's not a super new program, like just zooming out a bit on like year over year, or even like a three plus year trend line of like, just generally what's happening with like audience growth, social traffic and organic traffic, leads from those channels. Like, is this generally trending in a good direction? And then obviously if you do have data on, revenue and some of those things, then that's great. But like, I think those are kind of where I would say is ultimately the first step, because if you're not, laddered up to the right positioning, the direction of the company, you're not really engaging with ICP, then the third, like traffic and audience growth doesn't actually matter that much, because you kind of have to start over in some ways, because it's just kind of going entirely in the wrong direction. And it doesn't matter if you slap a pretty new CTA on all of your content. If it's not engaging the right people, it's not going to convert. So I think that's typically where I would start looking at it and trying to understand like if it's on track or where it needs to go.
What I think's interesting about that answer is like we definitely have interacted with kind of like the earlier stage companies, like seed stage,
Yep.
and people who, or just like the type of companies, like D2C, e-com, things like that, who put a different type of pressure on like, or define differently what ROI is. So like, it's interesting to hear you explain ROI in that example as kind of like directional based metrics, like things you're looking for and how you're communicating that. And just the idea that it might not always be direct conversion revenue within a content marketing program, which I think is it's important to stress because I think most marketers understand that, especially if they've got experience under their belt. But we do occasionally run into folks who just like have a very aggressive way in which they're calculating that ROI.
Yeah, I think. I think it's everyone comes into it saying, "Oh, I understand. SEO takes a year or whatever," which is not true. Like, you certainly have many examples of taking people from 0 to whatever in 5 or 6 months. Like, it's not like this automatic takes a year thing. But like, it's kind of like they'll come in with that perspective of like, I know this takes time, we're building for the long term, but then very quickly there's sort of these internal pressures for whatever reason to sort of prove that it's working, or someone's kind of measuring it incorrectly, things like that. And so, I agree. I think it's because it's not like, I would guess almost every content program ever would get shut down early if it was measured directly on dollars in, dollars out. Mm-hmm. In the first 6 months or whatever. Yeah.
So I guess and maybe you already kind of answered this, so we can circle back, but what types of metrics or specific KPIs, or even just like anecdotal discussion points have you seen work when you're communicating with, executive leadership, on thinking about revenue or ROI?
Yeah. I think whether it's like a new investment or just kind of like building into new areas or ramping it up, like, I think it's important to always try to align on how it's going to be measured ahead of time. So I think that helps a lot. Like, when you get 4 months in, it's like, no, we agreed, like, this was not we write these blog posts or we start this podcast and like revenue goes up. We're not measuring it that way. I think that's helpful as a starting point. I think also like agreeing to a cadence for check-ins. So if you're just in-house and whether you're reporting to a CMO or CEO or whatever, like let's agree to a cadence of check-ins early on, and then like just make sure you're not shying away from, if it's not working, like, don't try to like skip the meeting and hope that it's gonna be working by the next one. Like, have that like collaborative time to keep talking through it and figure out what's working, what's not. But I think, you need to come equipped with leading indicators, knowing that it's not going to just jump straight into, like we said, like revenue and leads and that kind of stuff, but like impressions, social impressions, organic impressions, whatever that may be, views, podcast listens, like, just generally like how is that trending? Engagement with the content, I think, is also important. Like, you can pump out 100 social posts a day across channels and get a bulk of impressions because you're getting a little bit across each, but doesn't mean anything, if there's not engagement. And again, like if it's newsletter, like subscribers, like there should be a number of those leading indicators that sort of show like we're progressing. We can kind of dig in and make sure these are the right people. Like we feel good about that. We're getting in front of who we want to get in front of. And so I think that, having the leading indicators and also those like qualitative aspects of our ICP is engaging, we're getting in front of the right audience, like all that stuff. So I do think that's really the early aspects, but so much of that is built on having that alignment up front on how it's going to be measured, when it's going to be measured, when we're going to check in and discuss progress, all that stuff.
For sure. I feel like I feel like every company I've worked with has had a different set of metrics by which they're measuring ROI.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating. Like at first I was very confused about seeing that. Like I was just like, oh, what's going on here? But then it like some of it came down to like culture, like the environment of the space, and like leadership's ability to accept kind of directional data as like, awesome, you're doing great. This is exactly what marketing should be doing. And then others were just like, I'm kind of similar to what I mentioned before, but just like, if it's not a direct conversion, it's not ROI.
Right.
So yeah, just like pretty interesting. And then some of it came down to their tech stacks. Like what tools did they have to even like measure very well, or their ability to hire a meaningful data analyst in-house, who would be better at it than a couple of marketers at interpreting like what's actually happening in a complex way.
Yeah. The amount of times we run into folks who are adamant that it's important that it's all about lead gen, whether that's, or demand gen or however they're phrasing it. And it might be MQLs or SQOs or whatever, but like, the follow-on question of like, do you have measurement in place for that? The answer is often no. And it's like, well, then let's pick something that you can actually measure. Cause like, what's the point of that? But I do want to clarify, cause I don't want this to sound like, all, content and some of these efforts are like free from ROI calculations, because they aren't. I just think that it is truly like a longer time horizon that you're typically needing to look at. And you have to have these leading indicators to know like that you are making progress towards that. And certainly, we've also had great examples of literally generating revenue, real new additional revenue for clients within the first 6 months, just from what we were doing, which wasn't even like an extensive program. Like, it's not that it's impossible. It's just that shouldn't be your sole marker of that, because there are other things that you are using that content for to build the audience, to build influence, to build trust, like all those things. And so, I just want to be clear that it's not that it's trying to skirt around like a true ROI conversation. It's just that it doesn't typically end well to try to say we're going to invest $10,000 a month into content marketing and it is going to generate a 2.3x ROI, in this amount of time. Sure. And so I think there's that. But over time, you definitely get to where you have enough happening, you have enough going on, and whether you're looking at attribution data or you're looking at the data they filled out as how'd you hear about us, sort of like the qualitative stuff in a form, you start to have enough that you can actually piece that together and have a good understanding of, okay, cool, these efforts actually drove, whatever, 600,000 ARR or something like that. And then you do start to build on top of that. But it never, even at, we generated millions every quarter from content, but it never was, well, what's this data report generating from revenue, or what about PR, or what about these case studies? Like, it becomes a whole on the program, but there's certainly the need to experience that over time. So I just wanted to clarify that it's not trying to get out of accountability. It's finding a way to show the stepping points up to where you would eventually see more of the revenue and the clear ROI picture.
For sure. I also think I've heard this conversation play out, and I can say, like, personally, having direct revenue put on your shoulders as a marketer, if you don't understand that it's this comprehensive thing, can feel like does weird things to you sort of mentally or psychologically, where you're like, do I just become an SDR? Like, how do I directly influence this thing? And then I think, you sort of angle towards as many like short-term, kind of like short-sighted vision of your marketing anyways, where you're just like, okay, every opportunity we take has got to be as close to the bottom of the funnel as possible. Or we're not doing ROI. But it gets away from what you've been talking about, which is like, there has to be a long-term growth plan or vision that you're just kind of accepting, like, we're generating revenue because we're doing the right things and we have a level of attribution. But that's like my only warning around like spending too much time talking about revenue is the only form of ROI.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a story that I've told before, just with like talks and different folks, but like I think one of the most pivotal things for me when I look back on it was probably in my first year, I would say, at Sprout. I remember having a conversation with Justin, the CEO, and I asked, what do you want me to focus on? Is it growth? I don't think I said growth at all costs. I think that phrase has sort of been popularized over time. But like, do you want like to grow as fast as possible in any way possible, or do you want to build a long-term like business and brand? And he said, I want to build a long-term business and brand. Because this was also like right at kind of the emergence of growth hacking and you should be growth hacking and like all this stuff. And it's like, we could do that. We could sit and tinker and try to like find something, or we can just build towards the long term. And so I think that became such a like North Star thing, and almost like a shorthand of like, is this something we want to do? Like, yeah, I'm a little short on my target for this month. But that doesn't mean that I should go, like you said, just into like SDR mode and just pound the phones and try to like close the gap. I understand, but like, do we have the fundamentals in place to hit the number next month? Like, that's where you start to focus, and like, are we building towards long term? And then obviously, that ultimately did pay off and really did kind of build and compound over the years. But I think that's an important distinction. Is like, for some companies, it may be like, no, we literally need, a short-term view, like growth, any way that we can get it for, the next couple quarters or for this year or whatever. Like, there may be instances where that is what's expected from the CEO. So I do think that matters and varies quite a bit.
All right. So I think, a good ending place for this discussion is like, how do we approach ROI when we want to do like a new content marketing initiative? So like, from my perspective, it's a little bit of like, what do I need to do, or what do I need to come prepared with if I'm talking to leadership about a new initiative I want to run? Like, what are you expecting to see?
Yeah. Well, I mean, at first, I think I kind of just said that, but like, every leader is different. So I've had the opportunity to talk with and work with a lot of different founders and CEOs, and and certainly even just talking with marketers who will kind of explain how their CEO views things. And like, there's certainly people we've talked to that it's like, our CEO wants direct ROI on everything, wants everything measured, whatever. Like, we run into that, and I've run into that. And then there's also people who, I remember a conversation, the CEO was like, I would put $1 million into content marketing today. if I knew definitively kind of what the plan was and like why we felt like that was the right plan moving forward. And they're just like, the CEO is just bought in on like that this is something we want to start now. We want to do it for a long time, and it's going to be a big part of our company over the next 5 to 7 years, and everywhere in between. So like just understanding the nature of the leader, I think matters. You can't paint a big vague picture for someone who's going to want direct ROI, from day one. So I think that's a big part. I think there's a really important thing that's, alignment with long-term goals. And so even if it's not being talked about a lot, any founder, CEO, CMO is going to have a long-term view of like, we want to get to this point and sort of envision that, over the time, like we'll build out a sales team, we'll build out outbound, we'll build out channel partnerships, whatever it may be. Like we kind of know this is like where we want to head, and you generally understand if like content isn't anticipated to be a big part of that or not. And so I think it's important to not try to force content marketing program to be this big, huge part of the mix if that's not sort of the long-term goals of the business, the CEO is not aligned, whatever, like this is what it is. Like, so I think there's that, but there, the number of people that are like, we think we should create content and be like the next HubSpot or like the HubSpot of our industry, whatever. And so again, that's sort of like, okay, well now we have this long-term goal we're looking at, and we're going to talk about how we build towards that. I think there's another, which is like the qualitative feedback from customers on the value of content. So you can sort of understand people that have come in. I think it's always important for marketers and everyone to really kind of chat with customers. And so that can be extremely helpful when you can hear some of that and bring some of the like, hey, here's some examples of customers talking about how much they love our content, which then kind of helps paint the picture like this is not just acquisition, this is also retention and customer education and a number brand building, a number of things there. But I think some of that like feedback from customers is helpful. I do think you should come in hand with at least a rough estimate, like here's kind of what we see from our competitors. Here's what their channel mix looks like. They have a podcast and they publish 4 blog posts a month, or, they're doing whatever other things it might be. And just kind of generally understand like, okay, well, this is their growth. This is, appears from the outside to be kind of what they're doing and the cadence at which they're doing it at. So, maybe roughly based on that, if we march at this, and this is what we think it'll cost, then like this is, over the next 2 years, this is kind of what we'd like to be able to accomplish. And then lastly, I think it's also just important to, in some cases, like you shouldn't be trying to copy your competition or really worrying that much about what your competition's doing. But there are situations from a content perspective where you can point out how much the competition is controlling the narrative because of the content. And I think there's some aspects of that, whether it's like, hey, their CEO's on social, and he has 50,000 followers and posts daily and does video content and all this stuff. And like, they're out there building so much more influence than us, or it's, they have really key middle and bottom of funnel type of content that when people are searching for us versus them, like they're actually the ones coming up. They're controlling the narrative on comparing the two, and we don't have a say in it. Some of those things I think can also be helpful. So, it's there. Like I said, there's not. I don't think a clear model. In some cases for large companies like SEO, you can do some projections and modeling. But for a lot of companies who are earlier on, like it's not worth trying to build some down to the decimal point projection, like it's got to be a combination of those things that I just mentioned, which to recap, I guess, are understanding that every leader's different. So kind of understand those nuances, try to get alignment on what you're wanting to do towards the long-term goals of the company, qualitative feedback from customers on kind of like the value of your content, rough quantitative estimates on like timeline and impact, and then examples of where potentially the competition is controlling the narrative, or openings where you think you have the opportunity to be the ones controlling the narrative.
Can we try like can we try an example, like a specific example?
Yeah, for sure.
Um,
I don't
so-
have one. Do I get to be the?
You get to
The approver?
you get
Okay.
to be the approver.
right,
So and I'll see if I can come up with supporting things I have. But like let's suppose we will just use kind of Sprout, right?
Okay.
And I think there's opportunity for an entire social media course. It's a certification course, similar to what you see. Like SEMrush has their academy, things like that. But I think I want to take advantage of this.
Yeah.
Like, what are some of your initial thoughts on like what you would need to greenlight that project?
Yeah, I think, initially my thoughts would be probably some questions around who the course is ultimately targeting. And if that in some way ties to like a reasonable expectation that they would become customers. So like, is it just going to be that now a bunch of professors in colleges encourage their students to take this course, as part of their course? Or is it, genuinely people who are going to do that, like post the certification on LinkedIn, like leverage that to get a job, and then, ultimately have a little bit more bottoms up, but like some impact on being able to like choose Sprout to be their tool to work with. So I have probably some questions around what the courses are, like, a beginner basics of that type of certification, or academy may not be as impactful as, for Sprout, like how to use listening to, improve product development, or, some of these use cases that within the business that ultimately would maybe bring some more qualified or larger type of clients or things like that, customers like that. So that would probably be one aspect of it, a rough idea of cost. Because again, this is a great example that like, yes, it's content. Yes, it should be ultimately ICP aligned, but like, it's not going to be this super clear, 50 people took this course and 8 of them became customers within 30 days. Like, you're talking about a longer, planting a lot of seeds, and it's going to take time. So I would say, cost now that you kind of want to like figure out how that pans out over time, costs to maintain that. Yeah, without getting deep into logistics of it, I guess. But I would say that's kind of the big ones. It's like, what's the content? Who are we trying to actually attract? How do we feel that this kind of ladders up towards the ultimately what we're trying to accomplish? And then just understanding just generally some of the costs around it.
For sure. Yeah,
Would be
and
the
obviously
initial before you get into the details. Yeah.
Yeah, and obviously depends on the context of like what already lives and exists and efforts have you done, etc.
Yeah. And I think, similarly, if someone said, also at Sprout said, we want to start a podcast, I think a lot of those same things apply. Like, what is it about? Who are we ultimately trying to attract? Like, generally, what's cost? And I think, in that case, there would also be the question of like, maybe more so than like a certification type of thing, like how else I would want to know, like, how else does this weave into the overall content strategy, and make everything better. In which case, then you would be able to provide a lot of examples of linking to podcast episodes from blog content and embedding episodes into certain things and
Sure.
a lot of that stuff. So, yeah, so I think there's a lot there, but that would be some of my initial thoughts, I guess.